The Retreat, Lacey, Part 2. As Lacey pulled into the retreat's parking lot, she felt the anticipation bubbling in her stomach. She loved working at the retreat. She got to talk to people all day. She got her steps in from the endless back and forth between the kitchen and the dining room. She could enjoy the outdoors when she was stationed on the patio. She loved being a part of someone's big day or their ordinary afternoon. And best of all, she wasn't being compared to anyone, because she was, without a doubt, the best. She was the most requested server, and she knew all of the regulars on a first name basis. She consistently grossed the largest tips and always stepped up to be the head server for a large party. She effortlessly balanced the million things that a server needed to keep in mind throughout a shift: the refills and sides of ranch, the modifications, and the discounts for employees. This was something she was good at. If only anyone other than her fellow employees could have recognized that. Lacey's whole life had been a contest in which she was an unwilling participant. She was the black sheep, literally, to her overachieving, fair haired twin sister, Leslie. Since she'd formed tangible memories, Lacey had always felt inferior to her sister. Leslie talked first, walked first, and raced past all of the milestones, effortlessly hitting them like the poles in a slalom ski race. Leslie excelled in school while Lacey was the average athlete. She participated in cross country, track, and volleyball, but her achievements were overshadowed by Leslie's handicap on the school's golf team, her residency on the school's honor roll, and her election as student council president. Leslie was 2 points shy of being valedictorian, something that irked her to this day. Lacey was forced to endure the faux well-meaning comments of teachers year after year telling her, "If you could just be more like your sister." To top everything off, Leslie was the kindest person that Lacey had ever known. She didn't begrudge Lacey for being different, although it was hard to imagine disliking being the preferred twin. She always made an effort to include Lacey with her friends and activities back when they lived in the same state. Lacey couldn't deny that her sister was nothing short of lovable. After graduating high school, Leslie chose to stay in state to study pre-law at Boston College on a full academic scholarship. Lacey, either out of desperation or wanderlust, set her sights west. This was much to the chagrin of her parents, who were both New England born and bred. The University of Colorado Boulder, although a good school, wasn't even on her parents' radar, and yet even they couldn't deny the beauty of the jagged peaks against the liquid blue sky. Leslie was the only one who had seemed truly happy for Lacey when she announced her decision to move to Colorado. She wanted Lacey to be happy. Lacey vividly remembered the day that she left Massachusetts. Leslie had volunteered to make the trip make the trip out with her in her car, with plans to fly back home out of Denver. Their parents had stood on the steps of their breathtaking 3-story colonial revival, watching the girls pack up the trunk of Lacey's white Subaru Forester. When the final bag had been carefully placed in the trunk, Lacey had said goodbye to her parents. Her mother had remained largely silent. Lacey had always been closer to her dad. Her mother had given Lacey one quick hug and turned to her father to do the talking. He had pulled Lacey into an embrace and said, "You can always come back home if it doesn't work out." So before she had even begun, she had been expected to fail. Leslie had told her to forget about it and that they should enjoy their last trip together as kids. Leslie had made them stop at all the kitschy roadside attractions, and they had camped out underneath the stars. Leslie had grilled Lacey about what she wanted to pursue in school, but Lacey hadn't come up with an answer that seemed to satisfy her. This had always been the difficult part about their relationship. They got along so well, but Lacey knew that Leslie was more similar to their parents than she would care to admit. "You've always been good at art," Leslie had offered. "There's like a 0% chance of making good money with an art degree unless you become a famous artist or work in a museum. And I have no interest in either," Lacey had said. "How about teaching then?" Leslie had asked. Lacey had rolled her eyes. "You know the saying, Les, those who can't." Leslie had slammed her hand on the steering wheel. They'd been driving in shifts, and it had been her turn. "Damn it, Lacey, you've got to be passionate about something." Lacey had been shocked by the sudden outburst from her normally even-keeled sister. "Well, excuse me for not knowing exactly what I want to do with the rest of my life at 18. I'm not like you, Leslie, Lacey had said bitterly. I know you're not like me. I know, Leslie had said. She had sighed. I just want you to be happy. I will be. Don't you get it? I need to make my own path. Away from me, Leslie had said quietly, and Lacey had seen a single tear streak down her sister's cheek. Lacey had been surprised by this. She had known her sister loved her, but she would never have guessed that she would have been insecure about Lacey's motivation for doing things. Ah, Les, that's not it. But as she had looked out the window at the planes rolling by, she couldn't help but think that it was. Her whole life she'd been compared to Leslie, and this was finally her chance to be her own person. Okay, she had admitted. Maybe, just maybe, it is the reason. But it's not because I want to get away from you. I just want to get away from being the disappointing twin. Leslie had looked at her in mock disappointment. But she had known. She had to. Even so, she had said what she always said, what was expected of her. That's not true, Lace. It is true. You're like amazing, and I'm not. But it's okay. I don't hate you for it or anything. Leslie had looked at Lacey with fear in her eyes. I wouldn't blame you if you did, she had said quietly. It's unfair how Mom and Dad treat you. We're just different, but it doesn't mean one of us is better than the other. They had driven for a while in silence. I like planning things, Lacey had admitted. Like our graduation party? Mom took most of the credit, but it was really me who did most of the work. Leslie had nodded. I know, and you're right. You are good at it. And yet, she had still seemed disappointed. I'll figure it out, Leslie, I promise. And she had tried. During her freshman year in Boulder, she was undecided, so she took lots of different types of classes. In all honesty, her real major, her freshman year, had been finding her people. She finally felt like she was somewhere she belonged. Peers at her school had similar interests, and she easily fell in with a group of friends. They went hiking and whitewater rafting on the weekends, took ski trips over spring break. She smoked a fair amount of weed and went to her fair share of parties. And she had never told anyone she was a twin. She had felt a small stab of guilt for this, but she knew Leslie would have understood. She might even have been proud. The most important person she met in her college experience was Dean. It had been close to the end of her freshman year, and she had finally chosen a major, hospitality. One beautiful spring morning, Lacey was late to her financial management class. She'd gotten too absorbed in a game of frisbee with her hallmates on the quad. She slipped in the back door of the auditorium, taking the only remaining seat next to a girl with a stunning black afro. A yellow comb stuck out of the top of her hair, and she wore large beaded hoop earrings that looked like they were handmade. Her nails were painted the color of spearmint candies, and she smelled like eucalyptus and lemongrass. Gold bangles clattered on her wrists as she typed notes on her sleek blue laptop. She had smiled in greeting as Lacey took the seat next to her. Just a heads up, there's probably going to be a pop quiz on what we learned last class, she whispered, not even looking in Lacey's direction. Shit, Lacey whispered back. I wasn't here last class. Dean had shrugged. The closer it got to summer, Lacey had been finding it more and more difficult to get her butt to class. She just couldn't resist soaking up the sunshine in favor of sitting in a dark atrium or auditorium. Her grades had been slipping as a result. At that moment, as if on cue, the professor told everyone to put their notes away and to prepare for a pop quiz. As she distributed the quizzes, Lacey searched frantically in the bottomless pit of her bag for a pen. Dean had watched her struggle for a moment before surreptitiously placing a pen on her desk. She had smiled. She could have easily been annoyed or put off by Lacey's delinquency, but instead she had seemed amused. Thank you, Lacey said. I'm not always this much of a mess. She was pretty sure that she was indeed always that much of a mess, at least when it came to school. But Dean didn't need to know that. Don't mention it, Dean said kindly. When she got her quiz, Lacey had stared at the page, as if she could conjure the correct answers. It was multiple choice. What had Leslie told her when they'd been studying for the SAT? If you don't know, choose one letter and circle it for all of the questions. That increases your odds of being correct. Lacey had no idea how that could be true, but she trusted her sister, the would-be valedictorian. She chose C for each of her responses. She was debating whether or not to be the first person to turn in their quiz or to just leave right then and there when she heard Dean clear her throat. She looked over and Dean had nonchalantly presented her quiz sheet to Lacey. Lacey had been dumbfounded. Was she serious? She raised her eyebrows in question, and Dean discreetly nodded her head, giving her the go-ahead. After class ended, Dean had hurriedly gathered her things and left. Lacey had to trot to catch up with her. Hey, I just wanted to say thank you so much for your help back there. You really didn't have to do that, she said. Dean smiled but continued walking. I know, but don't get used to it. You need to come to class more. You've missed 3 times this quarter, she said. Lacey was surprised. She'd noticed? Had Lacey even noticed Dean once? Or had she been too self absorbed? You're right. Hey, where are you going in such a hurry? Lacey asked. Dean was nearly jogging now. I've got to make my afternoon shift at the retreat, she said. What's the retreat? It's a restaurant and event space, Dean said. You know, weddings, reunions, parties, that kind of thing. Where is it? Lacey asked. Just outside of Netherland, Dean said. Lacey nodded. She'd attended the famous Frozen Dead Guy days in March and had a ball. Dean walked up to an orange Subaru Crosstrek and clicked the remote. Well, anyways, I hope you have a good day at work, and thanks again. I'll try to come to class more, Lacey said, in what she hoped was an earnest tone. I'd like that, Dean said. It's nice to have a friendly face around. Dean smiled. She started to get into the car when, at the last minute, she popped her head back up over the top. Well, are you coming or not? She asked. Lacey looked around. Was she talking to her? What? Lacey asked, confused. Come on, get in. Looking back, it was hard to say why she decided to get in the car with a complete stranger and tag along with her to work. Netherland was about 30 minutes outside of Boulder, and she wouldn't have a ride back into town. But Lacey felt a connection with Dean. She'd made lots of friends, but did any of them really know her? Or were they just around for a good time? Dean was more polished. She went to class, she dressed well, and she had a solid job. She was the type of good influence Lacey knew she needed in her life. They had talked the whole drive. There were no moments of silence or uncomfortability. Lacey enjoyed Dean's playlist, and they talked about music and movies they liked. They also talked about their families back home. Lacey found herself opening up more to Dean than she had to anyone at school so far. After about 30 minutes, they had pulled up to the retreat. Lacey's mouth dropped open. The retreat sat on the edge of a crystal clear lake, fringed by rolling hills coated with evergreens. The light glinted off the surface of the water. There wasn't anyone boating in early May, but there were quite a few people fishing on the banks. The retreat's large patio sprawled right up to the lake's edge, and there were various groups of people enjoying drinks and lunch in the sun. The building itself looked every part the mountain chalet, with stone walls and wood beams and a stunning arched entryway. Hanging from the vaulted ceiling was a sprawling elk antler chandelier. Lacey continued to gape as Dean swung into a parking spot. I know, Dean said, grinning. It's stunning, isn't it? Speechless, Lacey replied. And that had been her very first introduction to the retreat. She'd never been the same since. Now, Lacey entered the building through the service door, just like she did 5 days a week. It really was silly that she placed so much importance on this day, as she worked at the retreat year-round. However, there was a marked difference in the air on the first day of the busy season. She hung her keys on the hook by the door and turned the corner into the office. Daphne was already sitting there, staring out the window, and if Lacey wasn't mistaken, she smelled like smoke. Lacey leaned against the doorframe and crossed her arms. She took the temperature of the room before she spoke to Daphne. Daphne had been the front of the house and banquet/events manager for the 10 years that Lacey had worked at the retreat. Lacey would say that she was, overall, a great boss. But Daphne could be a difficult person to get along with. There were moments when she was downright delightful, but those had been fewer and more far in between the past few years. It had taken Lacey a long time to forgive her for what had happened with Dean. They'd had a few rough years since, but overall, Lacey respected her. She did her best to be cordial and agreeable. Mornin', boss, she said. Daphne turned to face her. If Lacey wasn't mistaken, she thought she saw sadness in her eyes. Well, look at you, all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed. We already have a damn bridal shower on the books, and it's the first day, Daphne said. It's going to be a hell of a season. And by that, I quite literally mean that it will be hell. Do you want me to listen or do you want me to respond? Lacey asked. This was one thing about Daphne. As difficult as she was a straight shooter, and Lacey felt comfortable being forthcoming in return. Ugh, my heart is telling me to say listen, but my head is telling me that I should probably get a dose of your overly enthusiastic, glass half full bullshit, Daphne said. But she was smiling. That one smile relaxed Lacey incrementally. Daphne was much more manageable when she was in her playful pessimistic mood, as opposed to her pissed off pessimistic one. Lacey grinned back. Well, in that case, buckle up, Buttercup. A hell of a season means a hell of a lot of cold, hard cash, baby. Lacey clapped her hands and rubbed them together. This was true. She had consistently made over 10 grand in tips alone each summer she'd worked at the retreat. Get out of here, loser, Daphne said, throwing a pen at Lacey's chest. Lacey caught it at the last moment. Thanks, Chief. A waitress can never have too many pens. She winked. Daphne rolled her eyes and Lacey walked down the short hallway to the kitchen. She took a deep breath. Beyond being good at her job, this was the reason Lacey had worked at the retreat for so long. She wouldn't say she had fallen in love with Callum O'Neill at first sight, but it had been pretty damn close. She first met him when Dean had introduced her to the staff that first day back in college. She had been struck by his ice blue eyes and firm handshake. She saw tattoos running up the length of his forearms, which looked strong and able. He was tall, which Lacey loved, being a tall girl herself. He had broad shoulders and a killer smile. But over the years, she'd fallen in love with who he was as a person, even more than with his looks. She'd pined for him ever since she met him, including the whole 7 years that she had dated Scott. If she was being honest with herself, at first she was a bit frightened by Callum. Chefs had a reputation for being demanding, ruthless, and insensitive. When it was busy, he was all business. He would bark commands to his crew, and he wasn't afraid to call a waitress out in front of everyone for making a mistake. She'd been on the receiving end of his wrath more than a few times as a new server. But in the slower moments, he talked to Lacey and the other waitresses. He asked questions about their lives and genuinely listened to their answers. He wasn't afraid to share about himself or to be emotionally vulnerable. Lacey was very attracted to his confidence, but also to his more sensitive side. Beyond all this, they had so much in common. Neither of them had completed college, they both enjoyed the outdoors, and they had similar taste in music and politics. Over the years, she had grown very close to him. She considered him a good friend, and she wished with all her heart that they could be more. But Grace. There was always Grace. And the girls. Lacey saw Callum behind the line looking over the function sheet for the bridal shower. He was flexing the fingers of his left hand and holding a butcher's knife in the other. She walked up to the server window slowly, not wanting to disturb his focus. She waited there silently until he looked up. She smiled. Happy best day of the year, she said. Now that's the spirit, he said, and he smiled back, his eyes twinkling. This was something else that Lacey admired about Callum. He was truly passionate about his job. Lacey found this attractive because she had struggled so much in her life to find something, anything she cared about deeply. Working at the retreat was the closest she'd ever come. It was nice to see someone put their everything into what they did. Daphne's in the bad place and the day hasn't even started, she said. Callum rolled his eyes. She'll survive. She always does. Yep, Lacey said, looping the tie of her apron behind her back. Specials today? Nah, not today, he said. Today's special is the absolute pleasure of eating at the retreat on the first day of an amazing, unforgettable season, he said. He paused. Too cheesy, he asked. Lacey melted. Just right, she said.